This is a piece I call Knife Fight, and I feel like it's the first ambitious piece I've started in my journey back into miniature painting. So a couple of weeks back, I did a video where I professed my undying love and passion for miniature painting, which is sort of coming back to the fore for me in my personal time, not necessarily on this channel. This YouTube channel is dedicated to art and creativity, and as a result, drawing in my spare time isn't something I do anymore because I do it for work. Which is why I'm really back into miniature painting, because all of a sudden I have this hobby that I can enjoy, that I'm taking my time with and really enjoying. I don't have to rush through it, and I end up being able to look at each new stage I've created and soaking it in and appreciating it and enjoying the result. You guys have been asking me to share my progress and the things I've made, so this is that. Now, keeping in mind, I am still doing this in my spare time. I'm not filming the process of making my minis, but what I am doing, which I'm hoping is a bit of a compromise, is that by taking photos of the mid-development places and sometimes doing like a turnaround filming shot of like a midpoint or a major landmark, that will enable me to put a video together like this that shows how I put it together, what the process was, and of course show off some of those slick cinematic final shots of the finished results. Now, to rewind a little bit, I'll start off by introducing this guy, which is, I'm going to call it my first serious miniature paint since getting back into the hobby. Now, technically I did paint a miniature when I did my VR sculpt of a Space Marine, and I sort of did that as a comparison thing, but I smashed out that paint job in 3 hours, and I didn't thin my paints, and I just could have put in a lot more effort and didn't apply much learning. So this little dude here is one I did a couple of months ago, which was my, I'm going to call it my starting point. I used to collect Blood Angels, and it was my way of just painting a simple Blood Angel Space Marine to show myself later down the line what my skill set was when I started. And I feel like in starting off, this thing looks really cool. I feel like I've retained a whole bunch of the stuff that I learned when I was younger, but also picked up a bunch of the newer stuff from the people that I follow and have been inspired by, that I mentioned in that I Love Miniatures video recently. So after that, I started a new project, and I started it from this little box here. I only had a couple of small Warhammer figurine boxes, and I just took some pieces of the main Warboss looking character from this, and I set myself a couple of goals that I wanted to achieve. And the first was I wanted to practice my sculpting skills, so I wanted to rework the pose in a dynamic way and use green stuff to try and create something unique with motion and dynamism. Now, green stuff, if you don't know, is that yellow and blue stuff that you mush together and you get green stuff. And this is what it looks like when I've started to re-sculpt the main character from this box. I hacked the entire center of the torso apart to re-sculpt the entire belly. From there, I sort of felt my way through the process until I came up with the idea of him holding the head of a decapitated enemy while kicking the body down. Which brings me to the second goal of this project, which aside from wanting to practice my sculpting, I really wanted to capture a moment in time and really create something dynamic in motion and in pose. So when I had the orc in a place I was pretty happy with, I needed to model a victim, which is where this little packet comes in. I literally just got legs from an Imperial Guard soldier and some arms that I simplified and removed some of the military insignia from, and sculpted the base motion of a pose. And as you can see, it's very blocky to start off with. It was really just to get the basics of the movement and the proportions right, so that then I could sculpt the shirt on the body and get some of the details and refine that. And this whole process is quite improvisational for me. So the fact that he ends up wielding a little knife was just because one of the hands happened to look like it was holding something, and I thought it might be cool if this victim has this little knife, and obviously the orc has a much bigger knife. And then the result is essentially the theme of this knife fight piece coming together. And I really started to feel like, okay, I've got this dynamic pose coming together. I've got a theme that looks pretty cool, but it all fits on one mini base and isn't overwhelming. Which is another thing I was trying to make sure I was finding a balance throughout the piece. But before I get to the painting, something I feel like I might just point out is that while I encourage and welcome criticism, I'm also not really taking it on board in the way that I normally do in my videos, because this is my hobby. And honestly, one of the things I'm finding most satisfying in re-embracing this hobby is enjoying and appreciating where I'm at. So I certainly welcome and encourage feedback and criticism and advice, but I'm gonna take it all with a grain of salt because I'm just enjoying it. Anyways, disclaimers aside, this is the process that I went through to create this miniature painting. Starting off with a base coat of just some colors overall. It's obviously very flat and uninteresting here. Next, a wash over the whole model in just an Agrax Earthshade, I think it's called. Now, next time I do a miniature, I'm even sort of second guessing as to whether I will use a shade, just because in the deeper crevices where it fills in a lot, it ends up sort of shiny and I end up repainting it anyway. After I had the base and the shade down, I focused on one section of color or material of the model at once, starting off with the green skin. And you can immediately see just when I go in and reapply the base to clean up the wash and apply like one small step up in highlight, how much of a difference it makes to the model's contrast and how cool it is to look at. So while lighting and shading wasn't exactly my focus on this model, I did want to start thinking about it actively and basically assigning a point of light which was just above sort of the head and in front of the model. So the top of the belly was shaded, the top of the muscles, but then as we get into the lower crevices or under the arms or on the back of the model, I didn't necessarily shade or create much contrast, but I more sort of directed where the light was coming from. So after the skin tone, I focused on the metallics and I wanted to go for a sort of rusty metal look. Now, I've never done rust before, and this is something that where I more focused on it or cared a lot more about how it ended up looking, I would have taken more time and done more research, but I just sort of roughed my way through this one, which started off with a bit of a brass base, did some shading and highlighting, used a bit of black and silver to create some battle damage, and it worked relatively well. So like I was happy enough with the result for what I was working on at this stage. But it's certainly something where next time I do rust, I'm gonna focus on it a little bit more. By the way, I did try and clean up the mold lines as much as possible. You'll see once or twice I sort of missed it a little bit, but I feel like overall I got a pretty smooth result. With a big skull metal sheet thing on his back, I sort of loosely dry brushed on a red to make it look like it was roughly painted, but also weather damaged a little bit. And after that, frankly, I was pretty happy with where the metallics and the skin tones were at, so I went on to finish off some of the more minor colors and details of the model, starting off with the leathers. And as with every other element of the model, I just sort of worked through reapplying the base tone and moving up towards a highlight, all the while keeping in mind where that point of light was meant to be relative to the model. So at the stage that I've gotten most of the color and shading down on the model, there were only a few detail bits left, starting off with the faces. So I took my time, I was very careful, and I even got one of these to use. Cool, huh? That way I could focus on the faces, dip the brush, and get really close. I look so sexy. I look really cool when I'm painting miniature details. If I walked in a room and saw me, I'd be thinking, what a cool guy. What a cool guy who has a cool hobby. So really took my time with the faces, really wanting to make sure that the specifically position of the pupils were in a decent place. I had it pretty easy with this model, I'll be honest, because with the orc, he has one eye, so it's not like I could accidentally do him derp-eyed or cross-eyed. And with the dead guy, I mean, he's sort of benefits by looking a bit derp. And then after applying a little bit of shiny blood gore to the brand new openings of the civilian character, this was the final result of the model before adding the finishing touches of the base itself and the motion and textures and special effects. By this stage, I really felt like I wanted to finish this thing off and show you guys because I was pretty excited about it. So I actually filmed the remainder of this process in the studio. I had painted a single coat of like this textury crackle effect stuff on the top of the base to create a bit of a dry earth texture. I mixed one of the mud texture paints that you can get with a couple of colors to make it look like a slightly muddier, wetter version of the same Martian soil, so that I could paint that under the civilian character while he's being kicked forward, and also paint that just sort of under the feet of the orc character, so you can really feel like they're stomping around on this earth together, and it just really connects the models to the base underneath them. Anyways, with this layer of mudded grit applied to my model, I set it aside to dry, and then I mixed up a batch of earthy colors that I mixed in some slightly larger teeny weeny stones with. The idea being that I could set those aside to dry as well, and then I could later glue in some recolored stones that fits a little bit more with the color of the landscape without having to put them down and then paint them after, because I really liked that crackly effect of the earth under these people's feet. Speaking of which, I actually also mixed slightly lighter hues of that same earthy color and just dry brushed on top of those crackles just to create a little bit of a highlight above where that point of light I mentioned relative to the model would be. And I feel like that added a lot of dimension and depth. So then with all of that drying, it was time to move on to the thing I was both most nervous about and most excited about, the blood effects. This would be the thing that, if it worked, would make the whole model feel like it's just dynamic, it's a snapshot in time, frozen. And to do this, I literally got like threads that you know, the type of thread that you thread needles with, like little threads, and I dissected those into 1/8 of their normal size. These are really, really fine, like barely seeable fluff-sized hairs that I tried to string out and glue to the various parts of the model. I applied the very tip of some of these threads with some super glue and then attached and painted with the glossy blood color, shaping it a little bit as I went, and when it dried, it actually held its position reasonably well. Doing the same thing on the knife, applying some blood first and then the hairs, hoping that they would dry in place, which they did, but it was harder to control the texture and placement of the blood because any movement to the thread would of course spread blood across the surface of my carefully painted knife as if that thread were a brush. What made this extra difficult is that the tweezers were constantly catching on the thread, or the super glue was sticking to the tweezers more than the thread. It was really, really finicky. But I could clearly see every time I successfully placed one and painted it and it dried in the right position that this was working, and it was working really well. So I stuck at it. It was pretty difficult, but once the threads were in place, I just slowly added a couple more layers of that blood effect to thicken it up in places and make it look like bigger globs of blood were flying in the air from the motion of the attack. Last but certainly not least, I apply the final finishing touches, and I gotta say, these are the sort of things that they're so minute, but they encapsulate that whole attention to detail thing. So I added a bit of gloss to his tongue so it would be a little shiny inside his mouth, and painted blood splats around the orc under his arm. On the shirt of the civilian, I just wanted it to look like it would look organically if this dude was just decapitated a split second ago. I applied some more of that brown shade to the deeper areas of the mud and dirt. It would make it look a little fresher and a little more wet. And then finally, I tediously glued in single pebbles and tiny, tiny rocks that had been repainted into areas of the model that would just help it have a little bit more depth, resulting in the final piece. I gotta say, this exactly did what I wanted it to. I really wanted to make a model that felt like a frozen snapshot in time, and I have to say, I am really happy with the result. This is better than anything I've ever made in a miniature project, and that is a cool result for me. Knowing I wanted to make a pose and approaching it with those specific goals in mind, making a really dynamic pose, making some unique sculpting and a unique character, but also something that felt like a moment frozen in time. This felt really cool. Now, obviously, it's very gnarly. It's pretty brutal. That's some of the first things that people, like either on Instagram or even when I show it in person, have said. I'm unashamed in my approach in what I want to do with these models, and it tends to be what I would have found cool as a teenager. So I apologize not, but you know, yeah, obviously, if you're not a fan of gore, you may not be a huge fan of this piece. The other thing I find really interesting too, that I'm really glad I did, is that it's just a normal civilian being slaughtered by the orc. The reason I find that cool is because all the time when you play Warhammer or you see people's miniatures, it's always these militaristic characters, even the humans, the Imperial Guard, everyone is ready for war. But in the lore of Warhammer 40k, which frankly I've been getting into more and more, there are so many civilians and planets of peace-loving or just unprepared people, either tribalistic or just completely separated from the wars of the 40k universe that they then invade upon. And the idea, of course, of the orc orcs is that they invade and just take over these planets, and just creating this moment in time of what it would look like with this orc just rampaging into a civilian place and just killing some random dude. I really feel like the visceral nature of that theme and this moment just works really well. So the point is, I made this and I'm really proud of it, and it was really fun, and I hope you love it too. Let me know in the comments what you enjoyed or what you think I could work on, and maybe I'll learn a thing or two, but at the same time I'm also mostly enjoying it. And I will share those models with you as I go, but at the same time, this has taken me over a month to do. So it's not gonna be something that you'll see every week, but at the same time, I'm getting into my minis. So it's certainly something you're going to be seeing more. Speaking of, for my next project, my goal is really going to be centered around light and shade and color. It's going to be tricky because I really haven't done any of that stuff, but I've been seeing a lot of stuff that inspires me. So I'm going to really focus on doing something that either involves object source lighting, which is where you have a model with something on the model that has light emitting from it, and that creates obviously some contrast and shade and hue variation on the model itself, or of course just some dynamic mood lighting or something really interesting lighting wise on the model. Painting light on the model in a way that gives it a space and a place and an ambience rather than relying on real world ambience or lighting to make it look a certain way. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed me sharing the process. Let me know if you want to see more videos like this and would like me to continue sharing my mini process with you. I'm really proud of the result. I had a lot of fun with it, and I hope you enjoyed it and had a lot of fun with me too. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like this video if you did enjoy it, of course, because that way other people who might enjoy it will see it, and it lets me know that you liked the video. And if you did like the video, I will link over there to some other videos you will enjoy as well. If you enjoy them or this and you haven't subscribe for more fun with art and creativity. Otherwise, that's it for now. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.